In 2019, I woke up at 4 a.m. with my heart pounding, I was sweating, and I had a dull ache in my right side. In a classic act of masculine denial, I rolled over and I slept on my left side because it hurt too much to sleep on my right side. A few hours later, I was sitting in the emergency room of a small town hospital, hearing a doctor tell me that my lungs were full of blood clots and that I was lucky to be alive. I was a new father. I was at the peak of my career, the peak of my physical fitness. I was the peak of what my life was supposed to look like, if you had asked me at that moment. For the first time in my life, I knew with undeniable certainty, with perfect knowledge that lives in your body, not in your head, that I was going to die, and I had no power over when that would come. What I'm going to tell you today is the story of how that morning eventually brought me to Jesus Christ, and how it ran through meditation in a way that I could never have predicted. I should tell you who I was before that morning. I was a tech bro, decade at startups, fintech, product manager, blah, 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 the whole enchilada. I biohacked, I lifted, I tracked metrics, I still do all that stuff. My identity was built out of achievement. My career wins, my physical performance, my PRs. It was a life that looked impressive from the outside, but none of it held up in the weight of that visit to the ER. In the days and months that followed my pulmonary embolism, I spiraled. My anxiety was out of control. I had paralyzing anxiety continuously, dread all day, every day. The excruciating terror of my death, the fact that it was inevitable, and the gulf of agony that I would leave behind me. I couldn't stop thinking about my daughter. She was 9 months old at the time, growing up without me. And that's because I had already lived that story from the other side. My own father died when I was 11. And when I was in the ER, I relived through my daughter's eyes all the unbearable pain, confusion, abandonment that I had felt as a boy whose father had disappeared from his life overnight. So I started reaching for help. I saw a counselor. I picked up a book by Thich Nhat Hanh called The Miracle of Mindfulness, something I had started years before but never finished. You know, I knew vaguely that meditation was supposed to help with anxiety, so I tried it. 5 minutes a day, then 10, then 15, then 30. And to my shock, to my delight, it helped. It helped a lot. Mindfulness traces back to the Buddha. The therapeutic version that is taught today, mindfulness-based stress relief, is derived completely from Buddhism. And so, you know, I made that discovery pretty quickly when I was going through all these mindfulness-based stress relief or reduction classes and materials. I learned right away that all of this was based on Buddhism, and it was working. And so I thought, why not read? Like, what did this guy actually teach? What does it actually say? So I spent my time reading the Nikayas, the foundational Theravada texts, the actual words directly transmitted from the Buddha down through his disciples. And as my discipline grew, as my meditation practice grew, it got to the point where I was meditating an hour a day, sometimes 90 minutes a day. You know, and it worked. I was patient with my family. My mind got sharper. I was unperturbed by things that would usually upset me. And you know, what also happened was, for the first time in my adult life, I started to see why I had all these patterns, and I started to have insight into my behavior. Why did I have all these self-destructive patterns? Why did I have these addictive patterns that really were in my life since the death of my father? And yeah, that meditation practice, it gave me real things. And so I dove in headlong because everything was pointing me there, pushing me further and deeper into that practice. But somewhere along the line, the further I went, the more I interrogated the teachings, the more things started to not add up for me. The Buddha teaches that the self is an illusion. It's a story that you tell yourself layer by layer until you forget that you made it up. That yourself is an accretion of these stories. It's just a story. There is no real self. The deeper and longer I sat with that idea, the more I found that the opposite was true. The more I meditated, the more deeply I found that I was encountering what I thought was my essential self. And, I started to notice too, unlike what Buddhism taught, that I was reaching downward into an essentially selfless void of consciousness. You're just, if you ask a Buddhist what you are is just awareness. You're just awareness. There's nothing actually there. Yourself, everything, the who you are, your soul, all that, they tell you that is just a story you tell yourself. But what you really are, you're really just your awareness. You're just your consciousness. But I had the opposite experience. The more deeply I delved, the more I unveiled who I was, who my soul, like I was encountering my soul. And I realized I was reaching outward. I wasn't reaching into a void. I was reaching outward towards something, towards someone. And I didn't have words for it at the time. I do now. I was praying. I was reaching out to God, and God was answering me. He was helping me. About 2 years into my pursuit of Buddhist meditation, I went alone to a cabin in the hills of Idaho for a 7-day retreat, solo, all alone, 16 hours a day of meditation. No phone, no books, no screens. I had planned everything so that I didn't even have to prepare any food. I had prepared every single meal. I had everything sealed up into individual containers for every single meal for 7 days so that I could spend every single waking minute meditating. And the first 2 days were really promising. My mind was clearing. I was entering states of effortless concentration that had surpassed anything I had experienced before. And, it's funny looking back now, strangely, confusingly, I kept seeing, when I was meditating there on my retreat, the face of a man who was unmistakably Jesus. And I kept seeing, as I was meditating, with no intention, no goal of trying to experience this, I kept seeing a golden cross throbbing with light drawing me into its warmth. At the time, I was like, oh, that's weird. Thought that was kind of funny, but I didn't really make much of it. And by the third day of that retreat, everything kind of fell apart. I'll go into that. I'll go into the details of it. And the short version is that it all just kind of collapsed, and I fell into probably a near psychotic break. I was living in sheer terror for almost 3 days because I had unstoppable visions that were terrifying. But what stayed with me after that time was the fact that when I was there, I was on a walk by myself, feeling low, feeling upset at how the retreat was going. And I had this moment where, I was considering the directive and the goal of non-attachment. That's one of the central goals of the teachings of the Buddha is that all suffering comes from attachment, from the things that you love. And I had this moment where I was just like, that's so crazy. Like, I love my life. I love my wife. I love my daughter, and like, it all just seemed like such a joke. Like, why would I ever want to strive for non-attachment to all these wonderful things in my life, I didn't want to detach from them. I wanted to hold them closer. And, I realized looking back now, that moment was the death blow, and that was the moment where I gave up on Buddhism completely. But, what happened was I was then left seeking again. I was kind of lost again. And, I had a lot of Christian friends who had been there through the pulmonary embolism, had been by my side. And, I had gone to them and shared where I was and shared about my seeking again. And, they didn't argue with me. They just handed me some books and pointed me to the Bible. I had read Genesis and Exodus and Ecclesiastes. I was an English major. I'd read Psalms, Revelation, but I had never read the Gospels. I had never read the New Testament. And so I read them. I started with the Gospels. I started reading C.S. Lewis. I started reading a bunch of Timothy Keller. And alongside that, I continued to meditate every day. And something strange started to happen as I read more and more of scriptures. It felt like I was discovering, not like I was discovering something new, but it was like I was unveiling something that was already in me. Like I was seeing the truth that I already knew was true. I've been a lover, like I said, I was an English major. I've been a lover of literature my whole life. And it was like I had this experience where I was like, all of the literature that I had read, everything I ever loved about literature was sort of the flesh and bones. And suddenly I was seeing the spine that that the body of what literature was hanging on. Like the Bible was the spine that was never there in my understanding of all of these things. Paul writes to the Romans that the law of God is written on the human heart. And that was what it felt like. The more I read, the more I kept having this experience like, oh, he's been speaking to me my whole life. I just wasn't paying attention. I knew before I knew. And I was saved one night in my living room when I was reading the Gospel of Matthew. When I got to the cross and Christ cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In that moment, he became real to me. In that instant, I knew some small shred of the unfathomable agony that he felt. He felt his father torn away from him and the crushing weight of that. I had this spiritual experience there that I still can't really put into words. It was just like I was at the cross with him. Somehow he was there with me right there in my living room. And then also too, we were somehow in the backseat of the car when I was 11 years old on the way to the hospital to see my father's dead body. And in that moment, he was weeping there with me and I was weeping there with him at the cross. And yeah, it was impossible to put into words what it was like, but in that instant, I saw what it meant for him to drink his cup of wrath, for him to feel the father torn away, to lose the father. I knew some shred of that in losing my father. I knew some part of what he was feeling. And I wept there in that moment. And I was back in the car seat driving to see my father. And I was there at the cross, and I was there in my living room with the Bible. And I just wept. At that moment, I didn't know that was the moment I first believed. But looking back now, that was the moment when everything changed. When I let go of trying to be the master of myself. When I saw that I'm a worm, not a man, scorned, despised, but still somehow he loves me. Somehow he's forgiven me. Somehow he could love me, that he could give me this gift of grace that I never earned, I never deserved. And every day since that moment has been, it hasn't all been perfect, but it's pretty easy to feel grateful when you can see the gravity of what he did and what it actually means. And looking back now, I can see that, meditation prepared me for that. And I don't mean that I earned it through meditating. I don't mean that my meditation practice produced it. I just mean that giving God that kind of attention and being present to what he was doing in my life, when then he decided to act and to turn me to him, I was ready to listen, finally, after he'd been trying to reach me my whole life. I had been giving him years of sustained deliberate attention. I just didn't know yet that I was aiming it at God. And that the moment of conversion wasn't the end of the work. There are ways in which, in a lot of ways, really, it was just the beginning of the work. Now, years into following Jesus, I was still struggling with substance abuse. I had been drinking and using substances basically since my dad died. Since he died, I would reach for whatever numbing, distracting thing, video games, pornography when I was a teenager, just trying to escape from my broken home, my alcoholic mother. That turned into drinking and partying in high school and college. And that turned into drugs and psychedelics and weed through my 20s and 30s. It was normal for me. Everyone that I knew was the same. All my friends were kind of broken, dealing with hang-ups and pain, stumbling down the same dark path as I was. And that pattern didn't break the day I was a believer. I'd get stressed out. I'd drink, binge, get high for a couple of weeks. Then I'd catch myself. I'd quit, go cold turkey again. 2 or 3 months later, the cycle would repeat. I would tell myself, oh, well, the Spirit's slowly working on it, which he was. But I was also lying to myself about how much I was meeting him halfway. I was living with that lie. I believed that it was enough to just let the Spirit work. And then about 2 years ago, I was back in the emergency room with a different scare. This time I had a swelling in my neck that turned up. I thought it was an infection, but they ended up doing some scans and found some nodules in my thyroid that showed high-risk growths. I got an ultrasound, and the night I got those results, I drove myself straight to the dispensary, and I binged for 3 weeks, hiding it from my wife. And it took me a couple of weeks to go through that cycle again, but when I came out of it, I had the most powerful conviction of my life. If I was really walking this Christian walk, if Jesus was really who he said he was, and if I was truly a follower of him, then I wanted him to be my only comfort. I wanted Christ to be my only comfort. And what I was doing in that moment when I binged again after getting stressed out and freaked out about my health was the same pattern that I had been doing since I was a teenager. And I had this conviction. God gave me the strongest conviction I've ever had, that I needed to be sober. I found a Christian counselor right away. He pointed me to Celebrate Recovery. Throw a little plug in for Celebrate Recovery if you're struggling with anything, any habit, hang-up, addiction. Celebrate Recovery is an incredible Christ-centric 12-step program to help people get their lives back under control and help to let God take control of your life. I've been sober now for 18 months, and what's happened in the last 18 months of my life has been more healing than I have seen in the last 20 years combined. And actually, I would say the last 30 years combined. My father's been dead almost 30 years now. The grip of substances that I thought would never let go, my addiction, I've been able to let go of. I've been able to forgive my mother for her own mistakes and pain that she lived through. I've been able to make amends with a lot of the people that I hurt, first among them my wife. And I've been able to reconcile with my father in ways that I never thought was possible. I've been able to give over mountains of resentment and pain, lay them at the foot of the cross. Christ has lifted them with the same perfect grace that he shows every sinner who's willing to accept his sacrifice. The Spirit did what I couldn't do. Years of trying to quit through willpower, I couldn't do it. Only Jesus could do it. Only the Spirit could do that work. And that's not a victory lap, I'm not perfect, I'm not finished, I'm very far from perfect. But I am telling you about it because, this testimony isn't just about conversion. I want it to be about what he's done since. And And honestly, what he has done since is the strongest evidence of who he is and what he can do for a sinner like me. But yeah, I just want to say, if you're a believer, and I don't want you to walk away thinking that I'm saying that meditation saved me. Meditation did not save me. Christ saved me. But meditation was the door that God used to get me to Christ. And I think that he could use it for others. And that's part of my inspiration for this project. I pray that meditation could be a path to Christ for others. And that, that work that he did was his. And I just pray that, this could also be a path for others. And, if you're watching this and you're not a believer and you're reaching for meditation the way I was reaching for it, to calm anxiety, to calm noise, to get control of your life, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I just want to tell you what I've found. And, the thing I was always looking for was a person. He was there the whole time. The Bible says he pursues us, and he pursued me. I'm not telling you that meditation produces conversion. Meditation does not produce conversion. God isn't a prize to be won by doing a special technique. But in my life, he used this discipline of attention to draw me towards God. And he opened the door, and through that door was the cross. And he drew me there. And this project only exists because of all of that. I just want to say, I'm not a pastor, I'm not a theologian. I'm just a guy that Christ reached through a discipline that many Christians have never been taught. And I think that discipline is your inheritance. And I want to help you build it into your life and build it into your habits and routines. And if that's why you're here, welcome. If you're just watching this because otherwise, welcome as well. But I do have an agenda. I want to draw more people into this biblical, scriptural practice. Thank you for watching. Before I sign off, I just want to say, Christ is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. I thank God every day for his grace. If you found this useful, please subscribe to the channel. Please also check out my website. I also wrote a longer version of this, which you can find on the website with lots more detail at restoringmeditation.com. If you got questions or pushback or concern, please leave it in the comments, or I love to engage with folks, or shoot me an email at restoringmeditation@gmail.com. Yeah, thank you for taking the time to listen to my testimony, and God bless you.